Hello and welcome to the Speaking Archaeologically lecture on evidence of Neanderthals being efficient hunters. In this lecture, we shall provide you an overview of Neanderthal subsistence studies and look at how the Neanderthals exploited the animal resources which were critical for their survival. Since the discovery of the first Neanderthal fossil in a German valley in 1856, the Neanderthals have been a subject of controversy among archaeologists and anthropologists. Over the last few decades, various academics have discussed Neanderthal behavior and evolution with the aim of highlighting the relationship between humans and Neanderthals. And often, these discussions have bordered on the edge of controversies, with some academics, like Tatterstall, convinced of the primitive behavior and savageness of the Neanderthals. Others, meanwhile, were convinced that they were an important candidate for modern Homo sapiens' closest ancestor. Although this argument, first proposed by Franz Weidenreich, has been accepted, many controversies and debates still surround the behavior of Neanderthals with respect to their subsistence, social behavior, as well as genetic information. One such debate concerns the ideas of Neanderthal subsistence and their methods of exploitation of resources. So far, the available evidence has been at least interpreted in such a way that there is no consensus on whether or not Neanderthals were efficient hunters or scavengers. Let us now look at some of these researches that were carried out in the past. And here's hoping that their overview will help us draw a conclusion on whether the species were hunters or scavengers. The early ideas of Neanderthal subsistence up to the 1960s. Since their discovery and acceptance as a distinct hominin species, more focus was laid on the anatomy of Neanderthals rather than their behavior, and it was not until 1923 that Boole described their diet by stating that the structure of their jaw pointed out towards a vegetarian diet rather than a carnivore diet. However, Boole and his contemporaries did not consider subsistence to be an important part of hominin evolution. The first research on dietary habits of Neanderthals was published in 1927, in which it was proposed that Neanderthals were chiefly hunters who used fire to roast meat, broke animal bones to extract brain and marrow. Excluding fishing and use of mollusks, it was considered that the subsistence habits of Neanderthals were the same as that of the Aurignacians. Interest in Neanderthals increased during the second half of the 20th century, and more discussions surrounded their subsistence in the 1950s. In 1952, Howell argued that Neanderthals were primarily gatherers who engaged in limited amount of hunting of mostly large herbivores. It was argued that their population were restricted to areas of higher densities of plants, berries, nuts, and small forest animals. Conversely, another argument stated they were largely dependent on meat, especially that of large ungulates. Reckler in 1954 suggested that modern Homo sapiens learned specialized hunting techniques and religion from Neanderthals, while Bruet argued that owing to their powerful build, Neanderthals were incapable of pursuing mobile prey unless they made use of traps, and this led to their ultimate extinction as a result of being out-competed by Homo sapiens. However, these arguments were not supported by concrete evidence, and it was not until the 1960s that a new set of methodologies helped throw some light on this topic. Theories from 1960s to the 1970s. The emergence of zooarchaeology had a deep influence on the subsistence studies of Neanderthals. One such study was carried out by Lewis and Sally Binford, who suggested on the basis of faunal remains in the Levant region that Neanderthal subsistence was characterized by generalized hunting strategy in which all the game resources in the environment were exploited. Following this study, a number of scholars were convinced that Neanderthals were efficient and cooperative hunters who used camouflaged pits to capture their prey. However, owing to extreme climatic conditions, they had to hunt and live in small groups. The turning point came in the 1970s, when a greater number of researchers began to acknowledge the possibility of scavenging among early hominins, but The general consensus was that hunting was an important factor in human evolution and that Neanderthals were efficient hunters, although it was argued that their dependence on the Pleistocene megafauna led to their eventual extinction. The Neanderthal subsistence from the 1980s. The works of C.K. Brain and Lewis Binford brought a major change in the perception of hominin subsistence. Brain and Binford show that early hominins were not necessarily efficient hunters, but have been scavengers, and in some cases, even the hunted. As a result of this study, many researchers studying Neanderthals started taking into account taphonomy. Binford added to this debate when he argued that the cut marks and the gnawing patterns on faunal remains from Swanscombe and Hoxton in England indicated scavenging of moderate-sized prey by Neanderthals. He suggested that Neanderthals were unable to hunt large game and were incapable of cooperation, planning and sharing, and that game hunting was uniquely modern human condition. Thus the idea that Neanderthals were scavengers became popular. Neanderthal subsistence from the 1990s to the present. Since the 1990s, studies of Neanderthal subsistence have become more specialized and now include paleobotany, zooarchaeology, isotope analysis, and osteology. All these branches, however, have yielded some complementary and some contradictory evidence, thereby increasing the complexity in Neanderthal subsistence behavior. In the field of zooarchaeological analysis, studies by Mary Steiner are of particular importance and show that based on the available faunal assemblages, Middle Paleolithic hominins, including the Neanderthals, occasionally scavenged opportunistically before 55,000 years ago, after which time both Neanderthals and late modern humans engaged in hunting. In response to her work, it was argued that there was no evidence of regular scavenging in Middle Paleolithic, and that Neanderthals were capable of focused hunting patterns. With the new millennium, however, the focus shifted from the hunting and scavenging debate to the breadth of Neanderthal diet. In 2000, Steiner and her colleagues argued that on the basis of mollusks and marine remains found in Italy, Neanderthals had a broad-spectrum diet. In contrast, Lev and others concluded in 2005, on the basis of carbonized plant remains from Israel, that Neanderthals probably consumed significant amount of legumes. Osteological analysis show that Neanderthals had powerful bite forces and used their incisors extensively, thereby implying consumption of frozen meat, crunched bone, etc. However, based on the fact that most Neanderthals lived short lives, around 40 to 50 years, in which physical trauma was a common event and patterns of injury were similar to rodeo riders, it was suggested the Neanderthal subsistence involves close contact with angry medium-sized ungulates, and that Neanderthal technology limited them to close-range hunting. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal remains show that the Neanderthals had a high N15 level, but a terrestrial C13 signature, indicative of a diet containing substantial amount of herbivore meat. It has therefore been suggested that heavy dependence on meat was the cause of Neanderthal extinction. Based on the overview of Neanderthal subsistence studies through the ages, it can be concluded that animal resources were critical for Neanderthal survival. And it is possible that Neanderthals employed both hunting and scavenging techniques to obtain these. Stable isotope analysis shows that 90% of their dietary protein came from meat, and numerous sites attest to the hunting of medium-sized and occasionally large herbivores, probably with hand-thrust spears or hafted stone points. A fragment of one such stone point was found embedded in the neck vertebra of an ass in Syria in 1999. The nature of faunal assemblage in Middle Paleolithic, in which no species seemed to dominate, show that Neanderthals employed opportunistic hunting methods. Neanderthals also ate any animal, like tortoise, mollusks, and rabbits, as is evident from the remains at Shanidar in Iraq. Plant foods and small game, as well as scavenged carcasses, may have been significant dietary components under favorable circumstances. On the basis of the available evidence, it can thus be concluded that Neanderthals were efficient hunters. However, whether they became hunters after a certain phase in evolutionary history, as is suggested by Steiner, or were engaged in a variety of resource procurement techniques, cannot be concluded with absolute certainty. Therefore, In the words of John Shee, the hypothesis that Neanderthals became extinct because they were inefficient hunters is in deep trouble.